So, hello everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Job
Anne Rubin.
Show.
Why did I say Anne Rubin?
I don't know, why did I say
Great.
Job?
Swap Anne. Perfect.
So, today we're going to be talking about the Risc-v, which you have been raving about for the past week and a half.
Yes.
So why did you want to choose the Risc-v?
Well, I'll be honest, I was looking through all of the topics that we had in our secret little list of all the stuff we're gonna do, and I picked a random one, and it was Risk. And I mean, it's not as if there's not a lot to talk about. This is Risk we're talking about, there's a whole, I don't know how far it dates back, to the 70s worth of history crammed into Risc-v, so plenty of juice to get into, plenty of stuff to tear through,
Yeah, well you have non-stop talked about it the past week.
It's because I've been constantly researching it, and I mean, as have you with the other episode that will be released soon. Ooh. There's a lot to get into, and it's an exciting technology, but anyway, we'll get into all of that later. But before we talk about that, let's talk about what we got wrong.
Last episode.
Because there was, unfortunately, a lot. As I say, planning kind of comes second, doesn't it?
Yeah.
As long as we get the gist of the episode.
I think, can I say what I definitely know we got wrong?
Well, go on.
So the bloopers, it wasn't bloopers, it was more of just added information. But actually,
Yeah.
I think next time I'm just going to have a separate episode dedicated to random side tracks.
As you say, it was a very hard episode to edit. How much was it originally?
Something like 34 minutes.
And you had to crop that down. A good 10 minutes of pure stuff. We had to put it somewhere. Let's talk about me, because with me, all my rambling, bound to let the tongue slip a bit. Firstly, Apple, macOS, the first GUI, it was not. GUI computers had been around for quite a while, actually. We mentioned Xerox PARC. They actually invented the computer with the first GUI. All the way back in the 70s, so it was not the first GUI. It was a very good GUI, but it wasn't the first. Bell Labs. I brought up Bell Labs just because they're a very famous science park. I said they invented the first telephone. They did not. Firstly, they didn't invent the first telephone. Telephone's been out for ages, you know that. Secondly, what I meant was mobile telephone, whatever you call them. But they didn't invent that either. They were very close to inventing the first telephone, but they were just narrowly beaten out by a company called Motorola with their Dynatac, which you've probably seen a Dynatac. It's really famous, really chunky looking mobile phone with the antenna and everything.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, the famous one. It's in all the Hollywood movies. It was kind of like the BlackBerry of the 80s, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. We're very sorry. Sumimasen. We will try to be smarter in future.
But before we start, we do need to talk about the history of the Risc-v.
Yes. Why is there a reason for why Risc-v exists? And there certainly is one. So, every single processor out there, from the one in your phone to the one in the PC that we're recording on right now, it has a chip in it. And that little chip, CPU, microprocessor, call it what you like, has a certain set of instructions that let it do tasks. So if I'm on calculator.exe in Windows 10 and I put in 2 times 2, that instruction will go to the CPU. The CPU will look for an instruction that can solve that, and it'll say, oh, I've got an instruction called times, and times can solve this. So it'll do that in the CPU, spit out an answer. Now, every processor has all sorts of instructions, but in general they fall into 2 big categories. There's CISC, or complex instruction set computing. What that means is a processor that has a lot of instructions, and then there's RISC, reduced instruction set computing, and that's a processor that has very few instructions. So if you imagine, if a CISC computer is performing a task, then it's going to use very few instructions because its instructions are more complex. So they can do more stuff, basically. That's why they have more of them. But if a RISC computer opens something, it's going to use more instructions, but because its instructions are more simple. Which also makes it more power efficient, which is why you see CISC in big desktops, and RISC in stuff like ATMs and, of course, phones. Or at least that was how it was. For most of history, all the way back until like the 80s, computers, most of them used CISC. If you were like a desktop computer back in 80s, 90s, you needed all those instructions to do all the complex stuff, business, finance, all these big things. You needed all those instructions, basically for the computer to function. The big, pretty much the one at this point, CISC instruction set is x86 or x86-64. Originally developed by Intel with their 860 whatever series that all began with 86, which is where it gets its name from, and eventually extended by AMD for 64-bit computing. And basically, the two of them, they knew they were onto something, x86 was massive. Pretty much every computer nowadays runs on x86. Yeah. So basically, you're Intel, I'm AMD. Look, we can make a lot of money out of this, you know?
Money.
So I'm saying we sign an exclusivity deal. So only you, AMD, and me, Intel, we're the only ones who are able to use this, right? Because, it's too valuable to let all those peasants over at NVIDIA use, obviously. Okay. We got a deal? Very good.
Deal.
But CISC can't be used for everything. An ATM does not need to know how to, perform complex algebra or whatever.
Yeah, maybe it does.
If you got, the ATMs at,
I would like to pull out 4 lots of 50s, but I want that to the power of -4.
Yes, exactly. 4 times the power of 40.
But you needed to complete a simultaneous equation because I don't know what's the best value for my coffee and a cake at the same time.
I don't know, maybe at Google's headquarters they've got some x86 ATMs, but let's say the vast majority of just really basic computers, stuff you don't even think is a computer,
embedded systems.
You're using the language now. Stuff like
washing machines.
Or the chip inside of noise cancelling headphones that actually cancels the noise. All of that is going to run on something called RISC, because they don't need all those instructions.
Simpler.
And the big RISC maker right now, or the big RISC ISA instruction set, is ARM. You've probably heard of ARM. They're kind of weird. So ARM, instead of doing what Intel and AMD did, as we so perfectly reenacted, and signing the exclusivity deal, ARM is a bit more generous. ARM will go, okay, you want to make a chip to power your smart sandals or whatever. What you can do, you can pay me, and I will,
give you the rights.
Yeah, I'll give you the rights to it, and I'll also give you instructions for how to make it, and you can, develop a chip to your standards.
Yeah.
That's better, but the problem with ARM is you still have to pay some massive license fees. It costs a fortune, and it's really not really scalable.
Some people might say it costs an arm and a leg.
See what you did there? But as I say, it's better than x86, where it's no, you can't make a chip. Why are you crazy?
Yeah.
We will sell you the chips.
But it's supply and demand, because if you want to make a chip, then ARM makes it very accessible if you've got the money, because actually that's the only other option.
Of course, it's better.
Because you can't, because you're not Intel and AMD.
It's better, but it's not great, which is exactly why. And it got even worse when very recently NVIDIA nearly gobbled up ARM completely for $40 billion. The deal fell through, thank goodness. But if that had happened, they could have completely shut off ARM and there would basically be chaos. And now in comes RISC-V.
What is RISC-V?
I'm glad you asked. Well, let me take you back. May 2010. We're at Berkeley, California University of Berkeley. California University of Berkeley, they've given us some pretty good stuff. They invented GIMP, which, is what Photoshop did, basically open source Photoshop. They invented BSD Unix, which is what macOS is based off of.
Yep.
Some pretty smart lads in there. And it's the Parallel Computing Laboratory, in particular. And in 2010, they began development of a thing called RISC-V. And initially, they did it... very interesting, they did it for education purposes. Because if you can imagine, if you're a student, you know, if you want to really pick apart and get to understanding how all these instructions works, it helps.
You create them yourself.
It helps if you actually know what the instructions are, which you can't do in x86 because it's all proprietary.
Oh, that means anyone can look through it and learn from it.
Exactly.
That makes so much more sense.
Yeah.
It really would help.
But eventually, the more they went, the more they developed it, the more interest kind of formed around it, and eventually they realised, you know, we've really got something going here. We could probably scale this up. So they set up, well, the cornerstones of Risc-v. It's open source, so everybody can see the instructions and, you know what they do, and obviously give suggestions for how it can be made more efficient. There's no licensing fees. Literally, just grab Risc-v and develop it as you would. Also, interestingly, you're free to add your own instructions should you want to.
So you can make it do what you want to do. You can customize
pretty much. If you need an instruction, if you think it's going to make it more efficient, if those smart sandals have a instruction specifically for auto sandal lacing, or I don't know how you do sandals, then you can add that in. And the best part is it still retains backwards compatibility with Risc. So good stuff all around, pretty much. They set up a big non-profit, Risc-v International, and it's got some pretty beefy backing. So over 2,000 companies back it at the moment. Yeah. And some of the premier members, some big names, Google
back it, yeah.
Huawei.
Intel and Sci-5, which we'll get into later, are all premier members of.
Right, and there's some other ones. I think Nvidia backs it as well.
I thought Nvidia backed it.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of hype behind it. It is lots of
people back it.
Yeah,
it's very well funded.
You can see the potential, can't you? But the thing about Risc-v is it isn't really an innovation. It isn't like M1, where M1 it's this new, it's so more efficient, so much more power efficient. It's more good, for lack of a better word. I don't know. How would you describe M1?
I'd say it's more simple.
Yeah, which really helps it, get a foot over x86. Risc-v isn't really that. In their own words, the worldwide interest in Risc-v is not because it is a great new chip technology. The interest in it is because it's a common, free, and open standard to which software can be ported, and which allows anyone to freely develop their own hardware to run the software. I saw that quote, that's on their webpage or whatever, and I think it pretty perfectly summed up what Risc-v is.
And it's good, and I think it makes it so much more accessible for everyone.
Exactly. I mean, we could go and make a Risc-v processor if we wanted.
We should do that after the episode on a different day.
We will need to get it printed and laminate. Whatever you do with chips and stuff might be a bit of work, but we got this.
Yeah. Next project and it isn't hypothetical anymore. R5 chips are already being developed by SI5 and T headquarters.
Which is, if you don't know, it's T-Head is Alibaba's tech division, if you will.
The question isn't if it's happening anymore, it's more how far will it go, because it's very current, it's working, people are using it, and maybe one day it'll be a desktop chip that everyone will use, because and especially that it's open source, anyone can add to it, and all of a sudden you'll just have one smart person who goes, oh my goodness, this is such a good thing, and they crack the code, so
exactly.
It becomes the next.
And this is really, the most interesting part of Risc-v, which is how far does it go? Will it stay as the ATM ISA, or will it eventually, your phones could be running Risc-v, your computers could be running Risc-v for all we know. But
I still think the proprietary people, they still have it, and Intel and AMD. Even though they back Risc-v, they still have very powerful and very smart people running behind.
Oh, yes, of course.
Because no one knows how it runs, because it's proprietary, they still have a slight edge. Especially because it's privately funded as well. They're earning money from it, whereas Risc-v is open source, so they can't make any money from it. It's non-profit.
There is, yeah. Although,
ups and downs.
What I did find very interesting is you could be, by Western Digital SSDs, you could be running Risc-v in a few years, because Western Digital have started making their SSD microcontrollers run on Risc. So
Do you have your SSDs?
oh no, mine's a Samsung. Although Samsung is also a backer, so who knows really? This is what I mean. The future is limitless with Risc-v. I don't want to hype it up too much though. There are some disadvantages which we'll get to. But in the meantime, how do you see Risc-v evolving?
I think it has the potential to evolve for people to use, but at the same time, will everyone go to it? But if it needs to have that big breakthrough, because it's definitely getting there, but it needs that final push to put. It's competing, but it needs that final push to be put on the level of wait. Do I use this? Do I use Risc-v or do I use
x86 ARM?
That's it. Because it just isn't there, but it has the potential. It's like we could nearly do it. We're nearly there. We just need that extra push to help people to understand how it works. But I think ultimately, if it keeps going the way it is, then we could see a lot more computers, phones, devices running off it because it's backed better.
Well, here's my take on it. Unfortunately, the reality of many open source projects is they've got everything there. They just need more backing to get it off the ground. That's what GIMP had that, Blender had that, Android definitely had that, and Android got very lucky because everybody loved it. But with Risc-v, I see it, I genuinely think Risc-v is going to run most embedded systems, especially with like, Internet of Things, everybody's got like a smart TV, smart watch, smart everything nowadays. I think a lot of those are going to end up running on Risc-v. Phones will have to see, because I think the problem is a lot of developers, Apple, Google's got their own chips now.
Apple's got their own chips.
Yeah, there's no real incentive to move away from that. With new company, if Samsung, let's say, I think Samsung still use like ARM chips, but if Samsung want to start developing their own chips, there's more of an incentive to go with Risc-v because it is, for lack of a better word, it is better than ARM in most ways.
I think it's definitely the old brands, the more not sustainable, the more well-known brands, the brands that have the backing that aren't going to go anywhere anytime soon. Well, I say that and look up into BlackBerry.
Oh yeah.
Hint to next episode.
Whoa. Yeah.
But actually, it's probably more appealing to the upcoming brands who find it as a way in rather than an alternative that someone like Apple or Google would swap to.
Yeah, I agree. It's like, you see that with a lot of open source stuff, to be honest. Like Google, if Google made Chrome OS in the in like the 90s, they probably would have gone with Unix because that's the big thing. But nowadays, because Linux is so available, it's no secret why they based it off Linux. They're used to working with it. Android runs on Linux.
But I think with all this big hype, there is a lot of disadvantages.
As there always are.
So the first disadvantage is Risc-v isn't the first instruction architecture to have come up and failed. Do you know any off the top of your head?
There was a big attempt by, Sun Microsystems. They invented Java, the language.
Oh.
Yeah. The big company, the A, is massive. They had a brand called the Spark Station, and that was based off Spark. That was Risc. It was proprietary, but Sun were really big on like open sourcing stuff, so they could have open sourced it in future. And they really wanted to go head to head with like the big brands. They had their own Office suite and everything, but they just couldn't secure the backing. So I think if Risc-v wants to survive, they really got to get their claws in and kind of hold on for dear life before they get that kind of support.
But like most open source projects, they do fail because they don't have the money, the perseverance, the people. They might have the people, but they don't have. Sometimes they have a better community, but they don't always have the best team constantly working on it 24/7 to improve it. And the funding isn't there either, so it could still fall through.
That's why most open source stuff only happens because it has the backing of a massive company. I mean, Linux only became massive because it had the backing of IBM, with their Red Hat operating system, Google with Android. Like, you need some big money behind this stuff, which sci-fi kind of have.
And on topic of money, it can still be bought out by big major companies.
Exactly, yeah.
And actually, if they are bought out by another company, it could just make it completely useless.
Who knows what happens?
Redundant. Especially if you think that someone like Intel ends up buying them to kind of wipe out the competition, because actually a couple £1 billion, or maybe more than a couple £1 billion, the company's almost forced into it because they need the money, especially if they're falling and failing, and a big company buys them in and then profits a bit off it and then cuts it loose. It would wipe out the competition very easily, again forcing people to use Intel systems over...
Exactly, yeah. It's like the old Windows motto, embrace, extend, extinguish. We support all this with all our money. We kind of, nibble a bits away, we get up all like cozy with the company and develop good relations, and then we extinguish. We buy them, we wipe them out. We either by making them proprietary or ending it completely.
Which actually is fairly smart on their part.
In our business if we were business students, we'd probably be talking about, oh, that's so economical. But just from a moral standpoint, I mean, it's about what Risc-v stands for, isn't it? I know that's quite emotional, but it could represent so much.
Oh my, I'm in flood of tears. But yeah, no, it could. There's so many easy ways it could just be wiped off the floor, and so maybe in 5 years it could be either the next biggest thing, or it would just be buried under the sandpit like so many other projects before it, and no one would know much about it.
What does give me hope is most companies, even the big ones like Intel and AMD, they know x86 is failing. Like Intel, for example, they tried to develop their own architecture under their Itanium chips called EPIC, which is definitely a bit of a worse name than Risc-v, but hey-ho. That failed miserably. Because the problem with CISC is, I know this is like the most diss at proprietary systems, but it's bloated. There's so many useless instructions in CISC that like are just no longer used. CISC, theoretically, it can run like games from all the way back in the early 80s, because it's been around for so long, and there's really no point supporting, wasting precious die space to support all those old instructions, which is why we're seeing so many companies switch to ARM, switch to Itanium, whatever that was supposed to be, switch to maybe even Risc-v, because x86, at least in my eyes, its days are numbered.
So unfortunately we're going to have to wrap it up there. But it's been great episode actually.
Been a big one. A lot of research went into this one. So
thank you for listening, and hopefully we'll see you on the next episode where we will talk about BlackBerry. I'm fairly sure, as many subtle hints have been given.
Not so subtle, you specifically saying BlackBerry, but
next episode will be BlackBerry.